Good Monday morning. It's a day of real whiplash in the markets. 30 minutes until the start of the cash trade. I'm Matt Miller.
I'm Dani Berger. Bloomberg Open Interest starts right now.
Coming up, Taco Monday. President Trump postpones strikes on Iran's energy infrastructure for 5 days, saying that the two sides have held good talks.
But Iranian media is pushing back, denying any negotiations, direct or indirectly, between Tehran and Washington.
Airlines seeing some of the biggest rebounds in terms of the stocks on the news, while energy stocks are plunging with the price of oil. Dani?
It is stunning market moves. Good luck if you're long or short this market. I honestly don't know how you trade this.
Yeah, I saw Brent down $16 a barrel at one point. So massive moves.
It's wild. And the worst of the moves aren't sticking, but directionally it is sticking. And you mentioned the travel stocks. I mean, this is a sector that the biggest of the rebound is still here with us. Carnival, by the way, this stock has been down 17% since the war broke out. This morning, United up 6.4%, Carnival up 6.7%. Ferrari, those shares are up 5.5%. So all of the travel, consumer, exposed to oil price type stocks, a big rebound this morning.
Yeah, Ferrari obviously very exposed to buyers in the Middle East.
Yes.
They had suspended deliveries. Take a look at commodity stocks after we see these incredible swings in oil. As I said, Brent crude at one point down $16 a barrel. Occidental coming down $4.50. Newmont Mining actually rebounding a little bit with the price of gold because it had been down to $4,200 for a while this morning, and it's now rebounded since. So Newmont is back up. CF Industry Holdings, which is a fertilizer trade, down 6% as those prices come under pressure as well. Dani?
Let's get to the latest that we've heard from the White House and Iranian state media. Joining us now is Anne-Marie Hordern, Bloomberg's chief political correspondent and co-host of Surveillance. And Anne-Marie, you were asking all of the right questions when this came out on Truth Social from the president. Who were the talks with? How do we believe them? What have we heard in the time since we got that message from the president this morning?
The message from the president was clearly a signal of de-escalation. He was saying that these talks were happening, and then the new deadline really would be Friday. As long as the talks were continuing, that they would not go after Iranian energy infrastructure or power plants.
Hang on, 5 days from this morning.
5 days from this morning.
Will be Saturday morning.
Right.
Yes.
So, well, end of week, right? End of the week. So what you have right now is the Iranian semi-official news agency, which obviously, and we've seen in the past and even present moments, they have been used for propaganda, but they all came out pretty swiftly saying that there are no talks, direct or indirect, with the United States. Some of them even saying that this has to do with the president's reaction to higher energy prices. Now we have the president speaking to Fox Business earlier this morning, asked about the Iranian media denying these talks, and the president is saying that talks were held as recent as last night. He said that they were held by Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and their counterparts. So we definitely want more clarity on who exactly the administration is speaking to when you have the Iranian media, semi-official, but state media, coming out and saying there are no talks. And on top of that, I think the market is questioning, is this just a call because the president, this tweet and this mini detente, because the president is feeling the pressure in terms of financial markets, or is the president trying to buy time to something else? And that is going to be a key question of today.
Yeah, so what kind of deal could we get is what I'm wondering, because the president himself set the goalposts at unconditional surrender and regime change. At least he's demanded unconditional surrender. So could we see anything else less than that result in a deal?
I think the three main things that this White House and even past administrations have focused on when it comes to Iran was no nuclear weapon. They need to curtail and get rid of their ballistic missile capability, which, if you've seen in the U.S. DNI assessment, Iran has, and we've also seen that play out during this war. They have ballistic missile capability and have been expanding it. And then third, of course, would be the money that this regime continues to pour into the terrorist proxies around the region, whether it's the Houthis, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Lebanese Hezbollah. Those would be, I would say, are the three real demands of this White House. What the president has almost talked about, and the Israelis have talked about as soon as this weekend with Benjamin Netanyahu, is that they're almost setting the conditions in place if there was to be a potential regime change. And the regime is intact right now, obviously. You can see that. The war is continuing. There is no real opposition, but the regime has been greatly degraded.
All right, Anne-Marie Horton covers the president for us. She's our chief political correspondent and co-host of Bloomberg Surveillance, bringing us the latest. We'll continue, obviously, to bring you headlines as they cross the terminal. Brent crude, as we've been telling you, dropped sharply after President Trump's post easing concerns over supply disruptions. UBS CEO Sergio Armati, though, expects energy prices to remain elevated. He spoke before this announcement in Beijing.
Energy prices are likely to stay high for the foreseeable future, putting some inflation pressure and also some pressure on the delivery chain or on the supply chain. And in that sense, the situation is a little bit unstable.
All right, so obviously the situation has changed quite a bit since then, but has it? Let's bring in oil strategist Julian Lee. He joins us from London. And Julian, Anne-Marie was making the point earlier when she was talking to Governor Myron on surveillance that, you know, a lot of these assets have been damaged very severely. We heard that from Fatih Birol of the IEA. So how much of a difference does President Trump backing off a little bit on his threats on Iranian electricity assets make to the price of oil longer term?
Well, I think what it does is it gives a bit of breathing space. Nobody's quite sure how to interpret this at the moment. Are talks going on? Aren't they going on? Nobody quite has a handle on who's talking to whom and where that might lead. But what I think it does do is it gives us a pause before fears of further escalation start to become real. And that escalation would undoubtedly include Iranian retaliation for any strikes on its power generation sector. And that would target power generation in the Middle East. It would target water desalination in the Middle East. And it may well target shipping. But what this doesn't do is free up oil and gas supplies from the Middle East for the rest of the world. There is no tangible progress towards reopening the Strait of Hormuz to oil and gas traffic. And until that happens, oil prices are going to remain high.
Julian, thank you so much for that. That is Bloomberg's Julian Lee. In markets rebounding, oil, you can see there, down this morning by nearly 10% as stocks move higher. Let's discuss how Wall Street is reacting. Joining us now is Academy Securities Head of Macro Strategy, Peter Tchir. Peter, how should we be viewing this? This is a market that is incredibly difficult to trade, and it's only 9:07 a.m. in New York right now.
It has been pretty crazy, and we're in the process of taking off some hedges. The headline came out, and I think you probably want to fade this a little bit. So when I'm looking at this, and I get to work with the generals and admirals, I think two things that are still left on the table is we have the Marine Expeditionary Force coming, right? So 5 more days gives time for the Marine Expeditionary Force to either get closer or get in the region, be set up, and provide additional leverage. And we believe that we want to do more attacks on the Iranian coast to basically destroy their ability to attack into the Strait of Hormuz. Right now, they kind of hide in caves. They come out, they shoot their missiles, they disappear, and that's going to take some time. So I suspect for the next 5 days, we will continue to try and degrade their defenses. Israel might do the same. So I think we're a long way from being able to say, hey, the Strait might be open or that Iran agrees to anything. So I think this is a little bit back to where we were Friday night.
But are you saying that, this morning's tweet appears to indicate that President Trump is backing off. He's de-escalating a little bit. But are you saying maybe he's just buying time to get more boots on the Gulf, maybe to potentially take over Carg Island?
Yeah, I think we will see in the next 24 hours. If we continue to hit their military targets, it'll meet what he said in his social truth, right? Because he just talked about the ultimatum and going after their power plants and energy infrastructure, right? That was all relatively new on Saturday night with the ultimatum. It has not backed off the overall military strategy as far as I can tell. So I suspect we continue with that military strategy, which Iran has to counter.
He said on Fox Business, I guess he was talking to Maria Bartiromo this morning, that we may see a deal by the end of the week. But I'll remind everybody that on March 6th, President Trump tweeted, there will be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. Does that, do you think, hold? Does the president really push for an unconditional surrender here?
I think that's really difficult, right? Iran still so far has demonstrated their ability to, keep, ships from going into the Strait. So I think we need to either really prove that we can allow ships to transit the Strait or do something slightly more aggressive. All of that, I think this is the problem, is we're in this race against time where the things that we need to do, which we will ultimately probably be successful in, just take some time. And the pressure on oil markets and all the downstream products is coming back. And that's kind of, that's why I'm more that this is a delay. Let this play out, because unlike other things like Liberation Day, for example, you could back off and it's A-OK because we kind of initiated and there was no direct response. I think here, how do you leave the region in a state where Iran is degraded to the point that they don't have the ability to reclose the minute our troops leave, that they don't have the ability to punish their citizens who they choose to punish the minute we leave. So I think this one's a little bit harder to just say we got victory and leave. I think that's going to be the tricky part, and almost why I think this has to just be creating room for a more push to really force the Iranian regime into accepting that, hey, the loss is inevitable. Stop now before you hurt your own people more.
Peter, there's a couple of options for what took place this morning and this weekend, too. It's something JPMorgan has pointed out, too, that on one side, maybe Donald Trump isn't telling the entirety of the truth, which would not be a great thing. On the other side, perhaps talks did take place and the Iranian media organizations aren't fully aware. But in this back and forth, doesn't also represent this idea that perhaps there are multiple factions in Iran, that maybe talks are taking place in some capacity, but then there are others trying to exert control. Doesn't this show just how messy this situation is and how far away we are from any sort of resolution?
Yeah, so two things. One, I do want to start. One of our generals has often pointed out that Iran has actually never won a war, but they've never lost a negotiation. So they are great at trying to keep things on the negotiating table while they prepare for more war and to deflect. So, they might also be playing games here as well. So I wouldn't just say that it's our side maybe playing some games. And having said that, I think as we look at that, that's one of the risks that we see is Iran fracturing into a bunch of independent groups, each with their own set of military equipment, each with their own agenda. And that's really hard, right? If you have 7, 8 different factions, each kind of doing their own thing, all deciding to say, keep fighting with the U.S., maybe while some other group says they don't want to. And I think that's really the hard part. We did such a good job, I guess, in terms of decapitating the regime. It's unclear who's there. But I have to say this, right? If you look at the IRGC, they have had intermarriages. So they're very closely connected from a family side. They are very wealthy. They're very motive, and they do have a bit of a decentralized command. So this could continue. So again, it makes it really hard. Who did we make peace with, and will that peace even hold?
All right,
if
Peter,
we get to that piece. Sorry about that.
Peter,
I was jumping the gun there.
No, Peter. We're gonna keep you on with us because you are Academy Securities is so stocked with experience and wisdom. We want to hear more from Peter Tchir of Academy on this program. We're going to check on the markets right now as well because we've seen an incredible turnaround here. S&P futures, which were down sharply this morning as oil rose. NYMEX crude was over $100 a barrel at some points this morning. Now we see futures higher, and you can see from this chart the amazing spike that we saw after the president's tweet, which shows, if nothing else, the power of the White House in these markets on a day-to-day basis. Brent crude right now back down to 101.36. That looks like WTI did 2 hours ago. So right now we're seeing a massive drop for these contracts, 10% moves. As I said, at one point, $16 off Brent crude this morning. Coming up, Trump's ultimatum for Iran invites escalation. This, according to Bloomberg opinion columnist Mark Champion. He joins us next with Peter Tchir. This is Open Interest. Let's get now to high interest. Look what's making headlines around the world beyond the ultimatum that the president has now elongated with Iran. 2 pilots were killed late last night after an Air Canada plane carrying 76 people collided with a fire truck shortly after landing at New York's LaGuardia Airport. The NTSB has launched an investigation. Meanwhile, LaGuardia will stay shut until at least 2 p.m. this afternoon. So far, over 550 flights have been canceled. And Newark Liberty Airport has resumed operations after it halted flights for about an hour this morning. Air traffic controllers evacuated the tower over a burning smell that triggered a ground stop. The disruption adds to mounting travel chaos across the New York region, across the U.S., with closures at one point at 2 of our 3 major hubs. Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee says interest rates could go either way. Cuts if inflation cools, and hikes if it surges, especially with the war in the Middle East creating tension. The Fed held rates steady last week, but markets are now leaning towards higher rates as inflation risks grow. Dani?
Let's get more on what we learned in the past 2 hours with the president on Truth Social saying very good and productive conversations, meaning that there could be a cease of any attacks on Iranian energy infrastructure for the next 5 days. Let's bring in Bloomberg opinion columnist Mark Champion. And Mark, you had been writing about it this weekend, that those attacks would be a serious escalation. But you see this as not necessarily a taco, if I can put words in your mouth, not necessarily backing down, but a postponement of 5 days of this ultimatum. How are you viewing it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't claim to know what is going to happen in the next 5 days. Trump may or may not know himself what he's going to do. But what I would say is that, we've been here before. Trump has a very flexible approach to deadlines. Sometimes, he puts them off just because he was never, he was just trying it on and he was never very serious. Other times, in this occasion, I think it is more serious. I mean, I think what your guest just before was saying was right on the money in terms of the fact that, look at what else is happening. You have, the Pentagon asking for another $200 billion in order to fund the war. You have Marines on the way. And, this is another area where Trump has form, if you like, which is that, he will continue negotiations and then at the same time have a buildup. And you're always speculating whether that buildup is just designed to strengthen his hand at the table, or whether he doesn't really expect to get what he is asking for at the table, and he's just making time to get all his ducks in order. So clearly the Marines who are coming, they were not pre-planned before this war began. So they are an adjustment of the war. And the question again is he bringing them to, and he just wants the time in order to get them in place, or is he actually looking for a way out? Because, the risk in terms of escalation to the stock markets, to the inflation, to the oil price, they're extremely high.
Mark, this gets to, I think, the heart of my question for the last 3 weeks has been, do you think the administration has consistent objectives for what they want to achieve here? Because the president has called for regime change. He's even said he would like a say in who the next leader of Iran is. He's also said he won't accept anything less than unconditional surrender, but it's starting to look like he'll accept just reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Is that a gamut, or, are the goalposts moving?
Absolutely. So I think you need to separate into 2 aspects. The first is that the Pentagon has had very consistent tasks, the goals that they are set to execute. And those have been extremely consistent. But they are not a substitute for the strategic goals, which ultimately have to be political. And there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that there have been any kind of consistently created goals that Trump had from the outset. He just sort of fired a bunch of goals covering everything. And that went right up to regime change. And regime change is extremely difficult to do from the air, as we're discovering.
Hey, Mark, thank you so much for joining us. That's Mark Champion of Bloomberg Opinion. And still with us is Academy Securities Head of Macro Strategy, Peter Tchir. And Peter, Mark, kind of confirming a lot of what you've been saying. I just wonder, after this, if you can do anything but just shrink your books and get as close to the ground as you possibly can right now. Or are there moments, are there parts of this market that you can trade in?
I think right now, if I've had to pick where I want to choose, I want to be long, actually, treasuries now. I think we kind of hit this point and maybe want to see if we fade a little bit from here. I think we are either going to get higher oil prices, which at some point are going to scare the global economy enough that we rally on treasuries. So I like 10s and beyond because I think recession risk starts coming into play, or we're going to get this little pause where rates can rally. So I like that. I'm also trying to figure out what's the way to invest in European defense. I'm trying to figure out who in Europe's going to make drones. If I look at Europe trying to, make their own military at some point, it's not going to happen anytime soon with, aircraft carriers or tanks or jets. But I think maybe they can do something in the drone space. So what's the opportunity there, right? How does Europe maybe build up a defense force around drones? Same time, how do we build that up? So I think there's opportunities. And I do think global energy production is still going to be a key, right? We are going to sell off and bounce around. But I think the reality is Europe in particular is going to wake up and say, it is insane that we ignore the North Sea, that we ignore so many of our own energy resources, that we don't refine and process enough of ours. I think Canada's got some of these same issues. So I think you're going to see this real global push to be much more independent and almost vertically integrated in nations. So each nation has to be a little bit more vertically integrated. So I think anything, oil field services, those companies will still do well. Maybe you want to fade it a little bit while oil comes off, but this is a multi-year play. And I think you got to look to nuclear, all these things that we were kind of looking at one point as the data center AI trade, I think are going to be this electricity independence trade. So those are where I kind of want to add my money as you get these opportunities.
Does this, you've been consistent in this pro-sec trade, Peter, for months now. Does it continue even if the U.S. backs out of Iran, if we find some solution, some magical solution that reopens the Strait of Hormuz and gives us a regime in Iran that we, and maybe more importantly, Israel, can accept? Or do you think that we're in some kind of forever war or wars as long as President Trump is in the White House?
So I think we were in this kind of steady state, let's call it a world order, where if anyone was kind of affecting, a rules-based order, it was China, right? China was pushing the envelope everywhere on that rules-based order. I think we are moving to a system, production for security and resilience or PROSEC, where every country's a little bit more independent. And I think, like in chemistry, you go from one steady state to another steady state. There's often some volatility and violence in between. And I think that's what we're going to see, these periods of uncertainty, volatility. And I think the takeaway is countries that figure this out are going to say, hey, okay, we escaped a narrow one if we get the strait reopened. How do we make sure that in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the road, we're not in that same state? And some countries will do something about it, and some will wow, this is all okay. Let's go back to business as usual. So I think you're going to see real push on this. You're seeing Europe even start maybe to fracture along the lines, Germany and France. I think France was always slightly more independent, saying we need to do these things. So I think that's where the investment opportunity is. Look at what's going to get looked through this. And yeah, maybe oil will go down for a while. I still think you want energy independence. You want control of your data centers. You want to make your own chips, right? It's a little bit scary that people are talking about helium and whether Taiwan has enough helium to make chips. These things all have to be better managed.
Peter, great to get your take. Really appreciate you jumping on with us at short notice this morning. Peter Tchir is the head of macro strategy at Academy Securities. For the latest on Iran, by the way, you can follow our blog on your Bloomberg terminal by typing TLIV Go. One of the things that you'll notice there is the amazing market moves we've seen. Here is Brent, for example. You can see right now it's down 8% at $103 a barrel. At one point we saw a $16 drop. Right now it's down just 9. We're seeing futures rise as well this morning. They were down before this Trump tweet, and now S&P futures are up 1.6%. We come back, we'll get a read on the mixed messages from Washington and Tehran with PNC's Amanda Agati. We thought we'd escape the purple haze of policy. It turns out it just got more intense. This is Bloomberg Open Interest. We are moments away from the start of trading on what is already an insanely volatile Monday. Futures were down when I drove in. President Trump tweeted that he's been having good talks with Iran and that we could see a complete and total cessation of war by the end of a 5-day period. Now you have futures up 1.5% on the S&P. NASDAQ futures up a little bit more. Russell 2000 futures up more than 2%. President Trump on Fox Business says we could have a deal with Iran within the next 5 days or sooner. He said. You've got Copa Airlines ringing the bell on the New York Stock Exchange. This is a stock that had been up almost 30% with reinvested dividends before the war. Now they are down more than 5%. And the same is true of Commercial Bank Group here. This is a stock that had been up more than 10% before the war, and now they're unchanged. So you can see a lot of the gains that we've had have been wiped out, which is just one more reason for President Trump to turn this thing around and back out of the Gulf.
And how much of that caused positioning to be low to the ground or short this market? And then how many of those shorts are getting punished today as we get this rebound? Because there is a big rebound, Matt, in markets. I want to show you some individual stocks that are moving. United Airlines, for example, up 6.3% at the market open. Carnival, which had fallen 17% since the war broke out, is now up 6.7%. Ferrari, which has also been tumbling as they've been unable to get their orders and their cars through to the Middle East, shares now up 4.3%. It's two different options for this market. Is this just the ultimatum didn't become tenable, so in the short term, President Trump is backing off there, or are talks actually happening? And in the latter scenario, that could mean maybe some of these gains stick, Matt.
Yeah, really interesting scenarios outlined there. And of course, we could see big moves in either direction. Take a look at what's going on with commodity stocks, because that's where you've seen the biggest moves today, in the underlying commodity and now the producers. Occidental actually down 2 2/3%. That's as oil drops drastically on this turnaround here. Newmont Mining higher because gold had been selling off pretty severely this morning, and it had been selling off since the war started. In fact, gold, which was over $5,000 an ounce, had dropped to at one point $4,099, but right now it's back up to $44.14. So Newmont Mining gaining ground, and CF Industries, which is a fertilizer trade, down still 6% as fertilizer turns around and drops in price as well. The prices, of course, have been elevated due to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Let's bring in PNC Chief Investment Officer Amanda Agati. And Amanda, the purple haze of policy was your theme for last year, and now it's very clearly the purple haze of war that's driving all of these assets. How do you invest in this kind of atmosphere?
Well, Matt, it's great to be with you. Good morning, as always. We've gone from purple haze of policy uncertainty to a deep purple reference, I think. Geopolitical risk and conflict in particular is hitting a fever pitch here. And I think investors are just going to continue to get whipsawed for a while. I'll give you another fun musical reference. It ain't over till it's over. Despite what the posts this morning say, there's just so many conflicting reports. I think the best way to play it is to stay nimble, stay very well diversified, and buckle up, because this high volatility regime is likely to continue. It's not fancy, but that's the best way to play this environment until we start to see some settling in terms of the conflict.
When you get these headlines, and let's just take today, you get these headlines and a market rallies, risk rallies. We're up 1.4% on the S&P. How do you decide whether that's a move you want to fade or stay away from?
Well, I think, one day doesn't make a trend. So we're not making big moves today, certainly as a function of the news over the weekend and what we've heard early this morning. But we haven't been making big moves. We haven't pulled the ripcord. We haven't raised a ton of cash, moved to the sidelines. If anything, we're looking for opportunities to add to positions. And so, markets off 6% off the high since the beginning of the year. That's not much to write home about. I mean, you can pick your spots carefully, I suppose, and individual names, but it's not like we've had this material market correction. The market has been surprisingly resilient. So do we get another crack at it from here? I think maybe, because we don't have a lot of clarity, even though we're getting this relief rally today. As I said, I think there's still a decent way to go here. And I'm not trying to throw cold water on it. I think it's really hard to pick spots in this moment to reposition position portfolios tactically. We need to zoom out. And see what the path forward holds.
I guess a lot depends on what kind of investors you're representing, right? Although I guess everybody from retail to institutional CTAs all want to get kind of neutral, get kind of flat here. Isn't that the case?
Well, it seems like that's the most defensive approach, right? To just stay neutral, to hang on for dear life, right? A technical term for you. I think in an environment where we have such high volatility, particularly on the bond side of the equation, right? Like that's not the story that we're talking about at the moment, but that's actually the bigger story than what we're seeing in equities and this relief rally this morning. The bond market isn't a believer, right? We haven't seen anywhere near as much move there on the news this morning, but the volatility story is way more significant than what we're seeing in equities. And so I do think that's an important dynamic here. Equities and bonds, fixed income, not on the same page in terms of the path forward. So, playing defense, staying neutral, staying nimble, hanging on for dear life, that's about all you can ask for in a geopolitical conflict scenario where you have really, unfortunately, a very binary set of outcomes.
Across the curve, we are flat. To that point, Amanda, this morning we started with yields higher, the gut punch reaction. They dropped suddenly after that Trump Truth Social post. And as we get the denials, they moved to unchanged. But we were just speaking with Peter Tchir of Academy Securities, who said the time is starting to come that bonds look attractive again, that it's not necessarily inflation that will win out, but it's recession concerns and this uncertainty that might drive investors back to bonds and yields move lower. What do you think of that?
Well, there's a lot to unpack as it relates to that outlook. We are not a believer that a recession is looming large here. That being said, from a credit spread perspective, from a volatility perspective, as it relates to interest rates, the backdrop for bonds has gotten more attractive just from a relative valuation standpoint versus equity. So I do think that there are some opportunities to pick spots carefully. Active management in fixed income is going to rule the day here. You don't want to be passive in fixed income markets, especially with volatility this high. So I do think that there are some pockets of opportunity. I don't think it's necessarily a function of recession risk or flows kind of clamoring for fixed income in this environment. I think it's just the nature of this very dynamic, fast-moving market. And I think it's just creating some small near-term pockets of opportunity.
What do you think about the big tech stocks, the mega cap, Mag 7 play here? It seems like it would be fairly defensive. It was when they were an asset-light group. Now, obviously, they have massive capex and debt, but still revenue that you can count on.
I absolutely think that those are places where we want to continue to have exposure. We are overweight exposure, tactically speaking, in the Mag 7 and AI-related, automation, robotic-related plays. I think that will continue to be a really bright spot. I think, to your question about defensive business models, asset light, all of those things are still very much the case, with the exception of valuations. We have had a valuation reset since the beginning of the year, but these things are not outright cheap. And so that's the one wild card. Again, if we had a little bit more of a downdraft, not that I'm wishing for more of a market correction from here, but we had a little bit more of a downdraft, we'd really be clamoring to pick up those exposures. Highly valuable, long runway, early innings.
All right, Amanda, thank you very much. That's PNC Chief Investment Officer Amanda Agati. And let's check on your equity market right now, 8 minutes into your trading day. And as Matt put it, it is the big tech stocks that are leading us higher. The breath was pretty good, 445 stocks up. But look at what NVIDIA is doing at this moment. NVIDIA up 2.4%, adding 12 points to the S&P 500 this morning. Apple adding 9 points. Amazon adds 6.8. Broadcom, Microsoft, Tesla. Tesla was down in the pre-market. Again, these are companies that are not exposed to the war. They're not exposed to energy prices like some of the consumer-sensitive stocks are, but it just shows you what positioning is doing at the moment, that we are adding in mass. Maybe some of the short positions were hurt. Maybe those things are unwinding. Maybe this is just an opportunity to refresh your portfolio in the volatility. Palantir is also up a lot. On the downside, no surprise, it's the things that have been doing well at the outbreak of the war. So the energy stocks, Exxon, Chevron, they are down at least 1.2%, as is ConocoPhillips. CF Industries, that is a fertilizer company, Lockheed Martin. So some of the military-focused companies like Northrop Grumman also falling, as is Oxy, down 1.7%. If you look at the sectors, everything is doing well except for energy. Energy is down 0.8% as the price of oil falls. Consumer discretionary, that's up 2.6%. Infotech up 2.1%. Joe, if you're in there in the control room, might be worth clicking in to consumer discretionary.
Oh, okay, yeah. I thought you were going to I was looking at month to date, and it's a mirror image of that, which is why it's pretty interesting.
That's an interesting one, but I just want to show you what's doing well in consumer discretionary. Norwegian, Carnival, Royal Caribbean, Carvana, again, companies that are really exposed to the consumer, to higher oil prices. They are all rebounding this morning. The question, though, will continue to be asked, is this just a short-term move? Does it say anything about the longer-term trajectory of this war? But for now, Matt, we are rallying pretty hard in a lot of these names that have been sensitive to the outbreak of the war.
Yeah, the cruise line's really the first thing I thought of when this war started. And they have really been incredibly volatile throughout. Coming up, airline shares are another one. They're up today after President Trump said he told U.S. forces to postpone strikes on Iranian energy sites for 5 days, stretching out his 48-hour ultimatum to a week. More on that next. This is Bloomberg Open Interest.
We want to see peace in the Middle East. We want the nuclear dust. We're going to want that, and I think we're going to get that.
Uranium?
We've agreed to that. Yeah, we've agreed to that.
You want the enriched uranium before you can end this war.
And we want no enrichment, but we also want the enriched uranium. If this happens, it's a great start for Iran to build itself back, and it's everything that we want. And it's also great for Israel, and it's great for the other Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, all of them, Kuwait and Bahrain in particular. So it's great for all of them.
If the war is ending, do you still need $200 billion?
It's always nice to have. It's always nice to have. It's a very inflamed world, and the Democrats inflame it. Largely the Democrats inflame it. Let me just talk about the others. So ICE has done very well. I've requested. Now, I'm a big believer that they should be able to wear masks when they go and hunt down, murderers, criminals, and others. But for purposes of the airport, I've requested that they take off the mask. I don't like it for the airport, and I believe they are willing to do that.
Mr. President, ICE wear masks not at the airport, but they need to do it when they're out in the country.
The people coming into the airport, typically speaking, aren't murderers, killers, drug dealers, etc. There may be a few of them, but there are many. They're people that want to come into the country, or that people want to leave the country, go into maybe their home country. So I didn't think it was an appropriate look for an airport. I think it's a very appropriate look when they're out on the street trying to find one of the 11,888 murderers that Sleepy Joe Biden led into our country.
Elon Musk, sir.
Last year you gave a $10,000 bonus. Sorry. Last year you gave a $10,000 bonus to TSA workers who kept showing up to work during the shutdown. Will you do that again?
Well, it could happen. It's amazing. There are people that are really, really loyal and great, and it's not easy for them. And this is all caused by the Democrats. Just so you know, all this money was approved. Everything was approved. This is done. The Democrats went in, and they want to have radical left lunatics come into our country. They want to have drug dealers. They want to have murderers come into our country. They want to have open borders, and we're not letting it happen. That's what this is all about. They don't want voter ID. They don't want proof of citizenship. They don't want mail-in ballots. They're so corrupt. What they want, the only thing they want is mail-in ballots. So we also added, as you know, into the Save America Act. And it's called Save America. It's not the Save Act. But we added no transgender mutilization of our children and no men in women's sports.
Elon Musk, sir, if these talks go well and you reach
I don't think he's going to be a newsmax.
If these talks go well and you reach a ceasefire agreement with Iran, do you believe Israel would abide by that agreement?
I think Israel will be very happy with what we have. We just spoke to Israel a little while ago. I think they'll be very happy. This will be peace for Israel, long-term peace, guaranteed peace. If this happens, and I can't guarantee it, but I think it's going to. My life is a deal. That's all I do is deals my whole life. I think this is something that's going to happen. And why wouldn't it happen? So tomorrow morning sometime, their time, we were expected to blow up their largest electric generating plants that cost over $10 billion to build. It's a very good one. There was no dearth of money. And one shot, it's gone. It collapses. Why would they want that? So they called. I didn't call. They called. They want to make a deal. And we are very willing to make a deal. It's got to be a good deal. And it's got to be no more wars, no more nuclear weapons. They're not going to have nuclear weapons anymore. They're agreeing to that. Any of that stuff, there's no deal.
Have they offered to reopen the
How are you
border?
you said you want to get the enriched uranium. How are you going to get the enriched uranium? Are you going to
It's very easy. If we have a deal with them, we're going down and we'll take it ourselves.
Can I ask you, the Treasury lifted sanctions on Iranian oil that was out to sea. You criticized President Obama for giving Iran $1.7 billion.
Well, I just want to have as much oil in the system as possible. And we don't even know if Iran gets that money. Frankly, I think it's very hard for them to get it. But you have ships that are out there that are loaded up with oil. Rather than keep it there, I would rather see it go to the system. Any small amount of money that Iran gets is not going to have any difference in this war. But I want to have the system be lubricated.
Even $14 billion, you don't think helps them?
Where's the $14 billion?
Because the inflated price, they get $14 billion from the...
I don't think they're getting the money. I could tell you, when this is all over, I will tell you who's getting the money.
Mr. President, the Marines from California, given that it'll take them weeks to arrive, is the intention to police the strait or take cars?
What are you talking?
Well, it's been reported that there are Marines that left California, left San Diego last week, at the end of the week. Why are they headed there now?
Well, let me ask you this. If you were in my position and I asked you that question, do you really believe I'd give you an answer? It's a crazy question.
Mr. President,
we don't talk about strategy. Yeah?
Another young woman was killed by an illegal immigrant that was let in under the Biden administration.
Let in by Biden.
Give a message for her family.
It's devastating. These people were let in by Biden. We're getting them out. We're getting them out fast. That's why ICE is so important. They're doing such a good job. This animal, I saw the whole thing last night. They gave me a briefing. Came in through Joe Biden with his open door policy and his border czar, Kamala, who never saw the border. Never made one phone call. All the ICE people, you see, they all know me. Everyone knows me. They like me. I speak to them all the time. Didn't make one phone call during 4 years. She was the border czar to anybody on the border. Never went there. This person came in through the open door policy of Joe Biden, and we have others. We're taking them out by the tens of thousands. We're doing a great job, but it's a shame. They've hurt our country. Just remember this. Joe Biden and that gang of radical left lunatics, some very smart, but radical left and bad ideology, sick people. These people have hurt our country very badly.
Are we directly talking with Iran?
Hitting those Iranian power plants. How is that different from what Russia has been doing in Ukraine by hitting Ukrainian power plants?
Well, I think it's a lot different. And if you look at the nuclear weapons that they wanted to have, that they wanted to possess, a lot of things are different. I'm not a fan of what Russia's doing either, just so you understand. All right? But it's a lot different. You're talking about a country that has been evil for 47 years. They've been horrible. Death all over the world, not just us. Look at the way they attacked unexpectedly all of those countries surrounding them. It was not supposed to be. Nobody was even thinking about it. But they wanted to take over the Middle East, and they wanted to knock out Israel permanently. And if they had a nuclear weapon, they would have been able to do that.
Mr. President, talking to Iran?
Mr. President, do you know whether Joe Kent was leaking?
Look, I'm not a fan of the guy. If you look at, and you never cover this, if you look at his Truths or whatever he went on, if it's X or Truth, if you look at his Truths or his statements, he was all for everything. All of a sudden, he wasn't. He was a man that I met at Dover. He came and his wife was killed. He remarried fairly quickly. His wife was killed, and I felt badly for him. He ran for Congress, he lost. He ran for Congress again, and he lost. I said, you know, he's a guy, nice guy, seemed like a very nice guy. I met him. He was pretty heartbroken, pretty. But I said, you know, it's a shame. He ran for Congress twice. Call him up, give him a job in the White House. Smart. They gave him a job in the White House, and this is what he does to me, you know? Being a nice guy doesn't pay off too much.
Mr. President.
Think of it. He loses twice in Congress, ran not very good campaigns, should have won, but he loses twice. How do I get him? I have my people call him, because I didn't deal with him for the most part. I saw him a couple of times, but I never dealt with him at all. I had no idea his ideology was left or right, whatever it is. I can say this. He said very strongly that Iran is not a threat. Iran's been a threat for 47 years, and there's not a country in the world that doesn't agree with me on that. So I take this guy, Joe Kent, who lost twice for Congress, pretty badly and tough, and was devastated. And I know that he lost his wife. So instead of letting him live out his life, I brilliantly have my people call him and offer him a job in security, essentially, in the White House. And what does he do? He goes out and he says that Iran is not a threat to get publicity. Now, he probably signed up with CNN or maybe signed up with your division of Newsmax. I don't know, but probably signed up with CNN or somebody. But if you look at his tweets, X's or Truce, whatever he uses, I don't know because I don't follow him. What he said is 100% he agrees with me. All of a sudden he leaves. I never knew he had a problem. Now, I hear they're looking at him for leaking. That's possible. But just so you understand, just to put it to rest, he lost twice badly. He also lost his wife. He's remarried since. He lost his wife. I felt badly for him. So I told my people, reach out to him, give him a job at the White House. This is the thanks I get. Any other questions?
Overall crime in Memphis. He said Iran was not an imminent threat, that's what the intelligence showed.
I think it was an imminent threat. I think that Iran, if we didn't bomb them with the B-2 bombers, now that set them back, but if we didn't hit them with the B-2 bombers, they would have had a nuclear weapon within 2 weeks to a month. And if they had a nuclear weapon, they would have used it as soon as they got it.
If you obliterated their nuclear sites last summer with your strikes, then how can you argue it was an imminent threat now?
Oh, we hit them so hard, we obliterated them. But that doesn't mean with the right equipment, you can't dig down and go get it. We don't want that, and we won't have that. But we obliterated that site. They still haven't been able to get it. That was a complete success. But if it wasn't, they would have had, if we didn't hit them, if we didn't use the B-2 bombers, which are unbelievable. We just ordered 22 more of them, modern version, by the way, super modern version. If we didn't hit them with the B-2 bombers, they would have had, within 2 weeks of that attack, that's why we hit them, because we knew they would have had a nuclear weapon. They would have used it on Israel and the entire Middle East.
Overall crime in Memphis is down 43% since you began this task force. Is this a template you think is working?
Well, what I'm doing today, really, this was a little bit before, set up a couple of weeks ago. This was before we had this situation with Iran take place last night. And by the way, they're just not communicating. When they say, I'm sure they don't mean that. When somebody says, oh, I didn't know you were talking. We were talking last night, and I'm sure they have a lack of communication, which is appropriate considering we blew up, in addition to their Navy, Air Force, every division, their radar. We also blew up all of their anti-aircraft and communication. So they have no telecommunications. So there is a lack of, I would imagine, a lack of coordination.
If you're worried about the miscommunication.
Well, we think all we can do is think, look, we have numerous leader groups. They've all been killed. Very dangerous position. Khomeini was killed. Khomeini's son is unavailable. Nobody knows what happened to him. I can say they haven't seen him there either. Something is going on with him. But regardless, I don't consider him really the leader. But they do have some leaders left because we blew up group number 1, group number 2, a lot of group number 3. But we think we have people that are very representative of the country and will do a good job in Russia.
Elon Musk has offered to pay TSA workers during this DHS shutdown. Is this something that you've been speaking to him about?
Yeah, I'd love it. I think it's great. Let him do that. And I want to thank ICE because they stepped in so strongly. They'll do great. And if that's not enough, I'll bring in the National Guard. We're not going to have the Democrats destroy our country. These people are the most destructive, sick people, the Democrats. They want, and they're fighting for this. They're fighting for men and women's sports. They're fighting for transgender for everybody. Everybody go out, get your kid a nice operation, and change the sex of your kid. They're fighting for, think of it. They don't want you to do voter ID. You walk into a booth. In California, if a person who's doing voting, an official, asks you for identification, they're subject to being arrested. What's wrong with this country? So we're fighting it hard. And I think they should, because the Democrats are being blamed for the shutdown, and it's their fault, and they're getting killed. That's why when I announced yesterday about ICE, the Democrats called. We want to settle. We want to settle. And I told the people, don't settle. Don't settle. Because we have something bigger. Only settle if you get the Save America Act, voter ID, and so important, proof of citizenship, etc. Thank you very much.
Whose idea was that to put ICE in the airport?
We're dealing really...
Whose idea was it?
Mine. That was mine.
Can I ask you,
That was like the paperclip. You know the story of the paperclip? 182 years ago, a man discovered the paperclip. It was so simple. And everybody that looked at it say, why didn't I think of that? ICE was my idea. First person I called was Tom Homan. I said, what do you think? He said, I think it's great. Then I saw today there was some masks on. I didn't think the masks were appropriate. I put out a statement and I asked them, would it be possible to take off the mask? Because they should wear a mask when they're dealing with the murderers and the thugs let into our country.
You said there's many points of agreement with Iran right now.
Many.
What, can you give us a
Many,
few of those?
like 15 points. 15 points.
Iran has said yes.
Well, they're not going to have a nuclear weapon. That's number one. That's number 1, 2, and 3. They will never have a nuclear weapon.
Said yes to that?
They've agreed to that.
Will we see illegal migrant arrests at airports, sir?
Arrests?
Will we see ICE arresting illegal migrants at airports?
Yeah, that's why the Democrats are going crazy. Because they've allowed, by what they did, and hold up, we put ICE, who are a very high level, I mean, they really are a high level group of people. And they love it because they're able to now arrest illegals as they come into the country. That's very fertile territory. But that's not why they're there. They're really there to help.
Are we talking to Iran directly? To no enrichment whatsoever, even for medical purposes, civilian purposes?
They have. Thank you.
What about the Strait of Hormuz? Who's going to be in control of that?
That'll be opened very soon if this works.
How soon? And who's in control of it? Will Iran still be able to control the flow of oil?
Be jointly controlled.
By whom?
Maybe me. Maybe me.
You want the United States to be in
Me
control
and
of
the Ayatollah, whoever the Ayatollah is, whoever the next Ayatollah. Look, and there'll also be a very serious form of a regime change. Now, in all fairness, everybody's been killed from the regime. They're really starting off. There's automatically a regime change. But we're dealing with some people that I find to be very reasonable, very solid. The people within know who they are. They're very respected. And maybe one of them will be exactly what we're looking for. Look at Venezuela, how well that's working out. We are doing so well in Venezuela with oil and with the relationship between the president-elect and us. And maybe we find somebody like that in Iran.
Are you considering any more options to lower the price of oil while these stocks?
The price of oil will drop like a rock as soon as a deal is done. I guess it already is today. No, we have a very serious chance of making a deal. That doesn't guarantee anything. I'm not guaranteeing anything. I'm not going to come out here in a week or 2 weeks and have you all say, oh, you said. I didn't say anything. All I'm saying is we are in the throes of a real possibility of making a deal. And I think if I were a betting man, I'd bet for it. But again, I'm not guaranteeing anything. They want to make a deal very badly. Thank you.
What changes would you like to see in DHS under Mark Wayne Mullen?
Well, he's going to be fantastic. He'll make his own change. He's already given me a list of people he wants to bring He's a fantastic guy. I think he's just the right guy. You all know him. He's a very open, smart guy, very successful actually in business, which people don't know, and he's a friend of mine. I think Mark Wayne is going to be fantastic. Thank you.
Are these direct talks going on? On the plane crash that happened there?
Terrible. They made a mistake. It's a dangerous business. That's terrible. Thank you.
President Trump there speaking to reporters, telling us a number of things that he's been talking with people. He thinks they're decent people that he's talking to in this evil regime. And he's looking forward to hopefully a deal that will, I guess, guarantee that Iran won't go after making a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, I mean, President Obama had a similar deal with them as well. But in this case, they're going to give President Trump the enriched uranium that we can't get to at their nuclear site that we obliterated after the 12-day war.
I think it's clear that President Trump, where the goalposts are, he was trying to maybe lay some of them out as much as one could, saying that when it comes to regime change, that it has been, quote unquote, obliterated. So de facto, you've had a regime change. And he said he has 15 points, and that includes no nuclear weapons, no enrichment, and the current enriched uranium, to your point, that we need to have. I thought it was also significant that he said that he had talked to Israel and that Israel would be happy with the deal, that they would like it, because there's been this question that even if the U.S. stops, what does Israel do in this moment? And yes, to that point, that he says that there's leadership that he's speaking to in Iran that he thinks are reliable, and he can have negotiations with them.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's one of the most interesting points, right? Given what we've seen out of this regime, you know, what he illustrated, we've seen out of this regime for the past 47 years, and given the fact that we didn't trust them in the previous deal that President Obama negotiated with Aaron David Miller, who's going to come on with us in just about 40 minutes' time. But he will trust them, I guess, under this deal, even though it's not really clear who's going to run the country. As he pointed out, the son of the Ayatollah, we haven't seen him. He says they haven't seen him either.
Right.
So he said he'll deal with whoever the new Ayatollah is, which is not totally accurate because it's not necessarily going to be an Ayatollah, right?
True. It could just be a supreme leader, but he does say
any
that
kind of, you know, supposedly supreme leader.
Right. But that person in Trump maybe would be the people who control the flows of oil. A lot to unpack. Let's bring in Bloomberg senior editor Wendy Benjaminson in Washington. Wendy, I know you were listening along. Can I just get your initial thoughts from what we heard from the president over the past 30 minutes or so?
Well, I think we have what he wants to have happen here. But at this point, we don't know if any of this is actually happening. Iran says they are not involved in any talks. That's the last we've heard from them. We've seen some reporting that says that Egypt and Pakistan were helping come up with these talks or helping, you know, facilitate these talks. But we're not really sure with whom. We know Witkoff and Kushner, his two favorite global negotiators, talked to someone and proffered this deal. But we have no idea what's going to happen. And yes, Israel knew this was going to happen, our reporting shows, but we also don't know what their reaction to it is. And if in 5 days, whether they will stop. Because if neither the U.S. nor Israel stop bombing, or if the U.S. does and Israel doesn't, Iran is still going to be hitting U.S. allies. I mean, they see the U.S. and Israel is in lockstep with this. So I think what's really happened is Trump very much wanted to calm the markets. You know, oil opened last night at, I think, 114, and it's definitely recovered since then. And so is the S&P. But that was clearly the goal. And also to find an off-ramp that he very badly politically needs. But how this will all shake out over the next 5 days, I don't think there is any clarity, to be frank.
One of the interesting things, Wendy, that President Trump told us is that if we hadn't hit them with the B-2 bombers, and I assume that he's talking about the strikes in June, the onset of the 12-day war, they would have had a nuclear weapon within 2 weeks to a month. Is that based on intelligence that's being widely circulated in Washington? Have you heard him say that before?
We've heard him say it almost every day, but his own intelligence community says that's not true. Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, gave her assessment to the White House that has been public that says they weren't close to actually having a nuclear weapon. And Joe Kent, the counterterrorism official who resigned, a real MAGA guy too, but he resigned over the Iran war, and he also said that intelligence showed that Iran was not close to making a bomb. This is a selling point that Israel has been using a lot, that Trump has adopted, that Iran was very close to making a nuclear bomb. The IAEA and other experts have, as I've laid out, have said not close.
Wendy, thanks very much. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson in Washington, D.C. Let's talk about how this is impacting markets now with Sitara Sundar, JPMorgan Private Bank Head of Alternative Investment Strategy. Sitara, it's been a lot of twists and turns, obviously, here. But I guess volatility is the name of the game since this war started. How are you advising clients to deal with this?
Yeah, look, I think that right now what we and all investors are grappling with is what we know and what we don't, and what the fundamentals are saying versus what volatility may be more sentiment-driven or short-term versus long-term. So what we tell clients is stay disciplined, stay diversified, and ensure that the risk that you're taking within your portfolio is intentional. Like I think history is always a really good guide. We came into these markets right now with one of the strongest bull market rallies that we've seen in the S&P 500 in years. So when we think about what to do moving forward, there's two things. The biggest thing for us is leaning in to opportunities where the fundamentals remain intact and where we have visibility from a cash flow perspective, regardless of what's taking place right now, whether it's geopolitical disruption or even what's happening within artificial intelligence disruption, which is kind of faded from the headlines, but is still a looming thing that's out there that we have to pay attention to. But then two, probably more importantly, is where investors and portfolios have kind of been offsides, which is shoring up the defensive part of your portfolio. And for the longest time, really over the past few years, defense meant bonds and bonds alone. And now that calculus is changing. So when we think about opportunities moving forward, alternatives for us is no longer optional or a nice to have, it's a need to have. And specifically within that, leaning into inflation resilient income, especially given the inflation volatility that we've seen over the past few weeks, core real assets, think real estate, infrastructure, and less correlated return streams to this idea of volatility. Relative value and macro hedge funds is something that we've been talking to our clients a lot about, honestly, over the past year or so, but they're proving themselves out so far this year, and that's where we would be leaning in.
A lot of the macro hedge funds, I wonder if how they are equipped for this moment, because a lot of digital ink has been spilled about this idea that they're all just degrossing and they're getting really low to the ground right now. How do you sort through for your clients which of those offer actual diversification in this moment?
Look, I think that's the right question. One, it's hedge funds is an industry, not an asset class, meaning that there's significant dispersion underneath the hood, not just within relative value and macro, but the entire asset class as a whole. So what does that mean? What do we look for? One, whether or not the underlying returns are actually less correlated. So we always stress test versus other periods of times of market volatility to see whether or not they've actually been defensive. And then two, what investment approach that they're actually taking. And even within the macro landscape, we're leaning more into discretionary macro, where there's more of an active management approach versus systematic and CTAs and trend following, because there's a little bit of confusion right now, as we all can probably be aware and understand, that the trends that have been taking place and the correlations that used to be there historically over the past 12 months is just not playing out right now.
What's your view on gold? Because I thought it was fascinating to see it sell off so sharply. The reversal itself is interesting, but regardless of the headlines, don't you want to own gold or silver here?
You do, yes. So what's happening over the past few weeks, we would say, is a couple of things. One, I think there's a technical aspect of it. We've seen a lot of flows go into gold, and in general, we're seeing investors reposition, taking profits off of the winners into some of the areas that have not been doing as well. So some of it is profit taking, some of it is short-term, what we think, dislocation, and gold moving a little bit more on rates in the dollar versus long-term secular demand growth that we see coming into that space. But the crux of it all is what we're seeing right now, we think, is more short-term volatility. We have still been telling clients to lean into gold as a diversifier, but it is really important to note that a lot of folks have been talking about gold as a pure geopolitical hedge, no matter what it is that's taking place in the environment. It's not just a pure geopolitical hedge, but it can still serve as a diversifier in portfolios over the long run.
If we are starting to see this volatility and oil prices moving higher, you talked about how it's important to just remain focused on the fundamentals.
Yes.
I wonder what fundamentals have changed. We were talking with Peter Tchir in the last hour, who basically said he likes bonds because there now is this concern about recession. There is this concern of what higher oil prices are going to do. We came in the start of the year saying it's going to be a great year for deals. You have all this stimulus coming from the fiscal government. Does the picture change at all if we are starting to contend with higher oil prices going forward?
Look, I think the number one question is, what is the duration of the oil impact? Because if it's a shorter term impact to the markets, we still think that the economy is starting off on a solid enough footing that we won't enter a recessionary environment. So we still are constructive on risk assets here. What has changed is, it's going to sound so self-serving, but the idea of active management and like underlying fundamentals, because everyone is talking about how markets haven't moved that much, but there's been significant dispersion under the hood, even within the S&P 500 versus Europe versus EM. So when we're thinking about the opportunity set moving forward, the need to be active right now has probably never been more important, because the confluence of factors that are impacting the markets right now has never been more confusing in terms of putting all those puzzle pieces together. So for us, bottoms-up stock selection really matters from a fundamental perspective. Earnings growth and visibility of those cash flows really matter. Strong balance sheets really matter, primarily because if we do enter a downturn, which is not our base case, but if we do enter a downturn, you want to ensure that cash flow durability is going to be able to withstand market cycles versus the short-term disruption that we may see.
I don't think it's so self-serving. When it's dark and stormy and you can't see the road, you want a pro driving the bus, right? I mean,
you do.
Sitara, great having you here with us. Thanks so much for joining us. Sitara, Sundar there of JPMorgan. Let's get a check of what's going on in the markets right now. It doesn't look so dark and stormy. The gains are almost 2% on the S&P 500, so back to 66.24. The Nasdaq gaining 2% at 24,373. You can see the two-year yield now back down at 3.84, and it's amazing that we saw it over 4% this morning for the first time since the 12-day war in June. Brent crude back down at $100 even, right where we saw NYMEX 3 hours ago.
Yeah, the volatility has been stunning. Coming up, more on this. We're live in Brussels with the U.S. ambassador to the EU as European leaders harden their stance against the war in Iran. This is Bloomberg Open Interest.
EU leaders have stepped up criticism of the war in Iran in recent days, continuing to resist President Trump's calls for allies to help America's military secure the Strait of Hormuz. Joining us now from Brussels is Bloomberg's Oliver Crook alongside the U.S. ambassador to the EU at a very fascinating time to have this guest, Oliver.
Absolutely, Matt. Yeah, I mean, it's been sort of talk here in Europe and has had obviously a huge amount of effect on the energy prices across Europe, the conflict in Iran, and of course caused a number of political disruptions that have varied quite a bit over the continent. So who better to speak to than the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, Andrew Puzder. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure.
I'd like to begin just with what we've seen actually in the last few hours, where we've heard from Donald Trump saying that there are discussions with the Iranians. The Iranians say there are no talks, and at this moment really not a very clear picture of what's going on. You are the emissary of the United States, admittedly not, strictly speaking, to Iran or around Iran, but what can you tell us?
Well, I think it would be an incredible good news for the Iranian people if this conflict were to come to an end. I think one of the difficulties is probably that it's hard to tell who's in charge in Iran. If I had to rely on anybody for that information, it would be the President of the United States. I think Jared Kushner and Ambassador Witkoff are really two people. If I were negotiating something for myself, I'd want those two guys in my corner. So they're talking. They know who they're talking to. They know what's going on in Iran, and I think I'd put my confidence in them.
And so, taking it closer to your role in the conversations you've had over the last couple of weeks with Europeans, obviously there's been a vast sort of array of responses. The Spanish calling it very directly an illegal war. We've had the Baltics saying, actually, you know what? Maybe the Europeans do have a role to play in the Straits of Hormuz. What do you imagine Europe's role is in Iran?
I think it's very important that Europe get involved. They get a lot more of their oil through the Strait of Hormuz than the United States does. It's really, most of that oil goes to either Asia or to Europe. So I think it's important that they be involved to protect their own best interest. I think the United States has gone into this to make sure that Iran didn't have a ballistic missile shield behind which it could develop a nuclear weapons program. I think it's pretty obvious they would have used those weapons, that they were developing missiles that could have reached as far as Europe if they don't already have them developed. I know they tried to shoot some off to Diego Garcia, and that's within range of Europe. So I'm hopeful that Europe will get involved and be supportive. I think Mark Rutte at NATO, the head of NATO, was saying that Europe was now organizing to get involved and be supportive, and I hope that's right. He also said this was the right move. I think he's right about that, too.
And one of the greatest impacts directly it's been having on Europe is obviously the increase in energy prices, whether it's oil, natural gas, having a massive impact. Obviously, the United States is one of the major suppliers, not the major supplier, to the European Union. You have warned against some of the regulations here in Europe, increasing basically the price of doing business with Europe and actually jeopardizing those supplies. Is that something that you think is cutting through in Brussels?
It is cutting through, but I think it'll be cutting through more significantly over the next year as the impact of the Iranian bombing of its neighbors, particularly Qatar, impacts energy supplies to Europe. Europe needs fossil fuels. They need energy. And if you need energy, what you want is abundant, inexpensive energy. You don't want to pay a ton for it. And all you get with these regulatory requirements are a limit on supply and increased price. So if Europe wants to have affordable energy, it's going to need to reduce the regulatory requirements and restrictions that it has in place so that we can sell oil here less expensively.
And can you quantify the sort of risk that Europe is posing here? Because we're talking about regulations that kick in at the end of this year and going into next year.
Yeah, the main one would be the European methane regulation, which is supposed to kick in January 1st of 1997. There was just a recent report that said that 80% of the oil that comes into Europe would not be compliant, and 40%, 43% of the natural gas. Well, that was before the Qatar loss of the natural gas coming out of Qatar. And so, but even if that report, let's say that report's half wrong, you're still talking 40% of your oil and 20% of natural gas, then exacerbated by what's going on in the Middle East. It could be a very severe energy crisis if Europe doesn't act. Europe needs to act.
And thinking also about the trade negotiation, this has, of course, been your main focus since you've taken over the role, trying to get this deal over the line. It has not yet been ratified by the European side. As you well know, there's a vote happening this week. Are you optimistic, A, that it will be voted on this week, B, that it will pass, and that there will not be any other delays? Why is it also, in your perspective, taking so long on the European side?
Well, one is I don't want to prejudge the outcome here, but all the signs appear to be good. I think we'll have enough votes. Thank God we had enough votes to get it out of committee. I think there's been a lot of political delays in getting this approved, and really not approving this deal would be, it'd be economic malpractice. Now, some people are going to find that they have maybe a political advantage in their home country by trying to teach America a lesson, but you're really going to be teaching Europe a lesson. Economically, this is clearly in Europe's best interest, and I'm very hopeful it will get through the process.
There are also other clauses being added to this. For example, the Sunrise Clause, which basically says that until the full legal framework is worked out on the U.S. side, that the Europeans won't, or potentially won't, implement this deal, which could put yet another delay. And my question to you then is, at what point is the patience sort of exhausted with the United States, and does the trade war basically restart?
Yeah, I don't want to prejudge any of these amendments. I want to see what happens. Number one, what Parliament passes on Thursday. Then number two, what comes out of the trilogue proceeding when the Council and the Parliament get in and start looking at what version of the bill they're going to pass. And then when that's done, we'll look at what amendments there are and react appropriately. But the saying, what I keep hearing from my European friends, and what I keep repeating is, a deal is a deal. And so let's get to the deal.
And I'd like to just get your final thoughts on one thing, which is the Ukraine war. Obviously, the distraction, the focus fully on Iran. The U.S. mediation efforts have sort of come back. Where do you see the path forward there?
I think right now the focus is on Iran and on the Middle East, and it will get back to Ukraine. I don't think anybody's taken their eye off the ball in Ukraine. I think we know what's going on there. But we need to get this. We need to get the war in Iran resolved.
Well, Andrew Puzder, thank you so much for joining us. That is the U.S. ambassador to the European Union on an important morning here to perspective on Iran, Ukraine, and of course that trade deal that's still stuck here in Europe.
All right, Oliver, thanks very much. Bloomberg's Oliver Crook with the U.S. ambassador to the EU, Andrew Puzder, there in Brussels. Let's get a check right now on the stock market. You can see that gas futures have dropped significantly. That's the same across the oil patch. Anything petroleum related has come down sincerely in price. Brent crude here at the bottom of your screen dropping 10.5%, 11.82 a barrel to just over $100. That has helped equity indexes rally hard. S&P 500 now at session highs, gaining more than 2% to 66.45. The NASDAQ gaining 2.33%. Dani was showing us earlier that NVIDIA was up more than 2%, and that doesn't hurt with the two-year yield coming back down to well under 4, now at 3.82.
Yeah, there was a moment where after Iran denied any talks with the U.S. that you saw two-year yields go flat. But what we heard from the president in just the last hour saying that he has indeed been talking to the Iranians, that there are what he called reasonable people there that he could negotiate with, that it wasn't the supreme leader, but it was top officials. That's helping to cement some of the turnaround that we're seeing this morning.
Yeah, coming up, Iran-linked cyber attacks hit U.S. companies, raising new concerns about AI security, or maybe making concerns about AI security more severe. The CEO of Checkpoint joins us next. This is Bloomberg Open Interest.
Iran-linked cyber attacks disrupting operations at companies, including Stryker. And those are raising new concerns for U.S. businesses and exposing gaps in AI security. Joining us now is Nadav Zafrir, CEO of Checkpoint, and he joins us from the RSA Cybersecurity Conference in San Francisco with more. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I would love to just get your thoughts. We've heard a lot of back and forth this morning with the president saying that he was delaying his ultimatum, if you will, 5 days of no strikes on energy infrastructure. Iran says that they have not been in talks. I just wonder, this type of volatility, this type of back and forth, does it change anything for you and what you're doing at Checkpoint?
Well, in fact, I think if the latest news about coming to a resolution are true, then we will probably see an intensification of the cyber attacks following that. That's what we've seen in prior conflicts. And cyber, because of its nature, is just one of those tools where even after there's a resolution, we will see more and more intensification of these cyber attacks. That's what we're preparing for.
Can you, Nadav, break that down and explain it to us? For example, after the 12-day war in June of last year, after we obliterated their nuclear potential with our B-2 bombers, did you see cyber attacks increase after that conflict?
Oh, absolutely. Cyber is one of those tools where you can use them in between kinetic wars and following kinetic wars. And we need to remember that we're not seeing these attacks out of context. They're happening at a time where we're changing our networks. There are three things that are happening as this war is going on and regardless of the war, right? Our first one is the democratization of the very capable tools, because more people can get access to these tools using AI. The second thing is that there's an agentification of our networks, and so at least for the short term, we're more vulnerable, and these attacks can be industrialized using AI. And that's why we're seeing this not just proliferation of capabilities, but also intensification of these attacks.
Can you lay out just how much that intensity has picked up or shifted or altered since the start of this month, since war broke out in Iran?
Well, I believe that Iran is sending a message. Everybody is vulnerable. And so they can either use it by kinetic strikes or using cyber. And cyber is a tool that they can use beyond, the capacity of their kinetic striking capability. And so I think we're seeing more of it. We're seeing new targets. And I think it's a message that the Iranians are sending, and they're using existing capabilities. I think in the next few months, we will see intensification and industrialization of these capabilities, of course, because AI is being proliferated and attackers are using AI just as we're using it in defense.
How has AI changed the game, Nadav? I mean, especially for the bad actors, how important is the development of this technology?
Well, it's absolutely changing the game. In some ways, we need to rewrite the game. Cyber is not really about technology. It's sort of a learning competition between offense and defense. And notoriously, it's an asymmetric learning competition and race. Attackers can learn faster and adopt faster because of several reasons. They don't have to go through the bureaucracy. They can iterate really, really fast because if they make a mistake, the price is very low. And so at least for the short term, we're in this valley of naivete where we are already incorporating AI capabilities into our networks because of their incredible capabilities, but we are creating new vulnerabilities that we don't even know yet, and attackers are notoriously taking advantage of that. And so that's where we are right now.
Are those new vulnerabilities, Nadav, data centers? Have we, as we undergo this project in the United States, but also globally to build out a robust infrastructure for AI, how at the forefront is the protection from cyber threats as these get built out?
Yeah, so when you think about it, if we go through these three stages of what's happening, right? The democratization means that more will have it. Industrialization means that the frequency will be faster, and agentification means that what we're protecting is dramatically changing. What we need to do is three things. Number one is we need to reassess everything that we've done in the last 30 years. Some of it requires fine-tuning, and some of it literally we need to rip and replace, and we don't have a long time to do that. The second thing we need to do is we need to secure the new attack surface that we're creating. These agents that, if we want to harness them, are creating new pathways within our organization. And so what we're protecting is changing. And the last thing that we're doing is we are using AI to protect against AI. And so we sort of look at it as, if you want, as RSA, right? We need to reassess, we need to secure the new attack vector, and we need to use the AI in order to secure against AI.
We are seeing, the president wants another $200 billion added to our more than $1 trillion military budget, annual budget. And of course, countries around the world are raising their budgets as well, most notably in Europe, because they're worried that they can't count on the U.S. Everyone, as Peter Tchir put it, wants to have an independent vertical supply chain. Are you seeing commensurate revenue growth, Nadav, with that story?
We're definitely seeing the potential, as you said. Cyber is a part of everything digital that we do. And because we are in a stage where everything is accelerating exponentially, we are also changing those infrastructure in order to harness AI. At the same time, creating new vulnerabilities. And so the answer is yes. An AI data center, just as an example, is a different infrastructure, and protecting it means that we will need to build new capabilities. So for example, at Checkpoint, we're building our new AI data center capabilities with NVIDIA. We're partnering with others to create the full security plane for employee uses of AI for the new applications. And the holy grail is creating a foundational model so that we can create what we call the guardian agent that will be able to not just put guardrails, because those may become obsolete very, very fast, but rather be able to do it in a runtime security fashion.
Nadav, we're going to have to end things there. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Nadav Zafrir, CEO of Checkpoint. Now, Peter Tchir of Academy Securities says markets may be getting ahead of themselves, warning the situation in the Strait of Hormuz remains far from resolved. Here's what he said to us on the show earlier.
You probably want to fade this a little bit. So when I'm looking at this, and I get to work with the generals and admirals, I think two things that are still left on the table is we have the Marine Expeditionary Force coming, right? So 5 more days gives time for the Marine Expeditionary Force to either get closer or get in the region, be set up, and provide additional leverage. And we believe that we want to do more attacks on the Iranian coast to basically destroy their ability to attack into the Strait of Hormuz. So I think we're a long way from being able to say, hey, the strait might be open, or that Iran agrees to anything.
Peter Tchir, macro strategist at Academy Securities. For more on defense, joining us now is Wayne Sanders, Bloomberg Intelligence senior defense weapons analyst and retired Army colonel. Colonel Sanders, we heard from the president about 30 minutes ago saying that he didn't call the Iranians, they called him. Saying that he is positive on a deal being reached, though could not guarantee it. What do you make of what we've heard from the president, along with denials from semi-official Iranian state media?
I think that it's a strong message if we deem it to be true. And I think one of the biggest pieces that we have to figure here is we still don't know from an Iranian leadership perspective who's really some of the power brokers that are in there. And so when President Trump says, I'm not talking to Khamenei, it's either a message saying, because we don't know whether or not he's even alive, or when you look at the senior IRGC leadership, he might be talking to somebody inside of that, because IRGC is normally the ones who actually help control wartime decision making. Somebody from the Supreme National Security Council, think of like somebody like Ali Shamkhani in the past, because that provides some plausibility for Iran to be able to say, well, you're not talking to the supreme leader, so therefore it doesn't count, even though they are trying to figure out what's actually in the realm of the possible.
Colonel, from a political standpoint, the best case scenario for President Trump and Republicans would be to pull away from this cleanly somehow, without boots on the ground, without spending more money in another Middle East war that drags on. But perhaps from a strategic standpoint or a national security standpoint, it makes more sense to leave forces there. How do you see this actually playing out?
Yeah, I think that President Trump's legacy, needs to stick to, hey, I was able to accomplish this without putting boots on the ground. There's too much of America that I believe that is afraid of another Iraq scenario, 2003 and beyond, for Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I think that being able to declare military victory based off of destruction of military targets, decimating a lot of the IRGC leadership, missile stockpiles, all of those things, those can all be taken as some of these strategic wins. I think the key is, like you said, is whenever you're trying to figure out how you're going to back out of this scenario, keeping the Straits of Hormuz open is going to be one of the biggest ones that he's got to be able to do, because if not, then all of this just stirred up a hornet's nest that other people have to deal with.
Right, because, the Strait of Hormuz was open before war broke out. And he, again, had told reporters that he thinks perhaps the Strait of Hormuz will be jointly controlled with what he said was the Ayatollah, but at least, a supreme leader in Iran, and maybe the president himself. Wayne, what we've heard from the Iranians, do you think that there's a likelihood that that could be the outcome, that Iran cedes some control of the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, I think, from an economic perspective, they're also looking for it, right? They don't want to cede any ground from a military perspective. They want to maintain their sovereign power. They want to be able to show that. But at the same time, they realize that the rest of the world is looking at them for that. So I think that's one of the bigger areas that even when President Trump is talking to Iran, when he's starting to look at different areas where there's no missile programs for 5 years, whether it's zero uranium enrichment, they're going to have to figure out some of the areas in there to be able to play, but they're going to have a say in what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz as well, to say, all right, this is how we're going to dictate some of these terms.
Colonel Wayne Sanders, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Wayne Sanders of Bloomberg Intelligence. Let's get a check on your markets this morning. Over an hour into your trading day, we're off of the most of the highs, but it's mostly sticking. At one point, the S&P was up 2.2%. We're now up 1.8%, being led by airlines and other consumer-related stocks. But tech is also up. NVIDIA trading higher this morning, so you can see the NASDAQ outperforms. It's perhaps the move in bond markets, which has been telling. At first, we did get a rally in bond markets after the president putting on Truth Social in the early hours, saying that he would delay any attacks of Iranian energy infrastructure for 5 days. And then the Iranian state media denies that, and you get bonds giving up some of their gains. And now the gains are back on after the president, about 30 minutes or so ago, saying that he has been talking with the Iranians, that it's not the supreme leader, but there are people he can speak with there, and was positive on a deal being reached. And Brent crude, the drop continues, Matt, down now 9.4%. We're trading at 101. And remember, in the early hours of this morning, WTI had reached $100 a barrel. It is a whipsaw in a market, and it's a painful market, whether you're long or short. Good luck to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Crazy volatility that we've seen this morning and in treasuries. At one point over 4% for the first time since June, since the 12-day war, and now we're down at 383.5. Let's get a look at some of the single stock stories at this hour. Travel stocks, as Dani mentioned, are rallying after President Trump postponed strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure. So you see big gains across airlines, across cruise operators, and high-end car manufacturers like Ferrari.
Ferrari's having a good day. It was up, I think, around 5% last I checked.
Yep.
Energy stocks, the other side of this trade, a lot of these stocks have rallied double digits, but they are giving back the biggest of their losses. So Chevron, Exxon, Oxy were all down pretty hard in the pre-market trade, tracking the move of oil. That undoes itself. Chevron still up 1.3%. Exxon, little change. And Occidental, still down 0.5%.
And mining stocks are also moving higher. Newmont Mining, Agnico Eagle Mines, Barrick Mining, all of these gold miners notably moving higher because gold had wiped out so much of its gains earlier this morning. We were down to under $4,200 a troy ounce. Now we're back up to $4,500 a troy ounce. And as a result, these miners are rallying as well.
And then another one of the very exposed sectors has been fertility stocks. Again, a difference in how these are moving. Make fertilizer. Wow, that's very different and would not be impacted by the war in Iran. Fertilizer stocks. CF Industries is down 4.7%. Mosaic, that is up for whatever reason, 2.2%. Nutrient, that is down 1.2%. Again, these stocks had rallied a lot as the price of fertilizer has been moving higher.
All right, coming up, more on the latest developments in Iran. We have a fantastic guest. Aaron David Miller is a negotiator who worked for the State Department under both Republican and Democratic administrations. It's possible that he is among the top 10 people with the most knowledge of this in America. So we're happy to get him from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Next, this is Bloomberg Open Interest.
I think it was an imminent threat. I think that Iran, if we didn't bomb them with the B-2 bombers, now that set them back. But if we didn't hit them with the B-2 bombers, they would have had a nuclear weapon within 2 weeks to a month. And if they had a nuclear weapon, they would have used it as soon as they got it.
And that was President Trump speaking to reporters in the past hour. He also said the U.S. is speaking with a top person in Iran. He didn't say with whom, but he clarified it is not the supreme leader. Joining us now is Aaron David Miller, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He worked at the State Department for over 2 decades, serving 6 secretaries of state as an advisor on Arab-Israeli negotiations. And Aaron, I wonder first your take on the president's claim that Iran would have been successful in developing a nuclear weapon within 2 weeks to a month if we hadn't initiated those B-2 bomber strikes in June. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Yeah, I don't think it's credible, man. Thanks for having me. Look, three false or unproven claims provided the justification for what has been a war of choice. I'm afraid now it's become a war of necessity. Number one, that the Iranians were within 2 weeks of producing enough fissile material to actually make and deliver a bomb. Number two, the Iranians had long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of hitting the United States. Also wrong. And number three, that if the president didn't strike, he had information that the Iranians were prepared to attack American interests or maybe in America itself. So no, that's not a credible claim.
Well, now we are in this moment, Aaron, where the president says that he is talking with Iranians, that it's top officials and not the supreme leader. You yourself have led many negotiations in the region. How would that be possible at a time when we've seen many of the top leadership being taken out in Iran? What would that type of negotiation look like? And what is the possibility for agreements to be reached and agreements to stick?
Dani, thanks for having me. Look, I think the chances of any agreement soon are slim to none, and I think slim's already left town. You need 3 basic elements for negotiations to succeed. You need 2 parties who are willing and able. I'm not sure you have that. Number 2, you need a shared sense of urgency. That is to say, the amount of pain that is occurring because you don't have a negotiation is somehow countered by the amount of gain if, in fact, you enter into one. And number 3, you need a deal that's doable, that both sides could accept. I don't see any sense, frankly, on the part of what remains of the Iranian leadership in Tehran or President Trump, who has been wandering all over the parking lot in terms of what this war was designed to achieve and what it can achieve right now. I think what you heard from the president this morning that sent oil prices plummeting, the markets rising, was an effort to basically find a way out of the ultimatum he had issued, that within 48 hours, if the Iranians didn't open the straits, he was going to attack Iranian infrastructure. I think he had to find a way to back down from that. He did back down. I think the Gulf states were pushing hard on him to back down because they knew that the Iranians were not going to bend in the face of that ultimatum, and then would come after their oils, in not just oil infrastructure, power grids, desal plants. So again, I think this is another move in a very dangerous, complicated game. It's not a game, complicated conflict that essentially is going to play out over the next several weeks or longer.
One of the problems that the president, I think, had, and that many of his MAGA base have with the previous deal that we had, the JCPOA from 2015, is that they didn't trust the Iranians to declare, enrichment sites, which is understandable, especially if you don't know exactly how these things work. If we have a new deal where the president says Iran agrees not to develop nuclear weapons and hand over its enriched uranium, what could we do? What set of conditions could we lay out so that we could actually trust that they're not enriching uranium or trying to develop a weapon at some other undeclared secret site?
Yeah, I know the Iranian nuclear deal that the president walked away from in 2018 was a highly flawed, but it was a functional agreement. It restrained, constrained, put a fair amount of time between where Iran is, which is now a nuclear weapons threshold state. That is to say, before these strikes, it had all of the elements required to actually make a nuclear weapon. It hadn't made a decision to weaponize. This war of choice could actually accelerate the Iranian desire, its acquisitive desire to actually have a nuclear weapon. You now have in charge a clear domination by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and other hardline elements. So I think that's the paradox here. The Iranians, as far as I'm concerned, could have been developing discreetly, secretly, elements to weaponize. That's always the case. In the end, bottom line, guys, there are no good deals with Iran. There are only deals that are less bad. And what the president has done here, it seems to me, is to turn a war of choice into a war of necessity. He now has no choice but to find a way into a negotiation that will result in significant American compromises in order to open up the straits. And that is what this is about now. It's not about regime change. It's not about undermining Iran's capacity to project its power abroad. It's about how do you relieve the global economy from the kinds of pressures and fracture that it's under if, in fact, this goes weeks or even longer without a deal.
Of course, the irony is that the Strait of Hormuz was open before this conflict started, if that is now indeed the goal of what the president is trying to do. And Aaron, you hinted at this, that in order for some sort of negotiation to be reached, there needs to be urgency on both sides. There was this Wall Street Journal piece over the weekend essentially saying that Iran believes it's winning the war and it wants a very steep price in order for it to end. You were just talking about that the U.S. needs to give concessions. What might those need to look like in order to get the Iranians to the negotiating table to reopen the Strait of Hormuz?
I mean, I think that's the real problem. The Iranians are going to want guarantees, probably, and not just by Trump. They're going to want them sanctioned by the UN, the international community. They'll get the Russians and the Chinese to buy into these guarantees and to pressure the administration. That's one thing. Number two, they're going to want reparations for the destruction and damage done. That's not going to happen. Number three, as crazy as it sounds, they're going to demand and want sanctions relief. And frankly, this is a highly transactional president without a strategy. Again, he's wandered all over the parking lot. Imagine the extraordinary development of the United States of already unsanctioned 140 million barrels of Iranian oil. I mean, that's head exploding given what we know the administration would like to do, is to weaken and fracture the regime. In the end, the Iranians are going to want sanctions relief as well. I don't know what the flexibility is on the part of this administration to provide any of these things. It seems to me that any constituency that Donald Trump cares about in this country, almost without exception, would breathe a collective sigh of relief if tomorrow The president of the United States said, you know, I'm done. Here's what we've achieved. The war is over. The real question in the end, Dani, is whether the Iranians will let him out. And frankly, right now, geography is destiny. They can shell the Gulf states at will, and they can decide who gets through the straits. Iranian oil's getting through. Oil from China's getting through.
Yeah, and Aaron, we're going to have to end things there, unfortunately. We're just coming up to the break. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Aaron David Miller of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.